Welcome, students. So, if you missed last class, this is here to catch you up. Last unit, we went over the basically what was happening in the events following the Second World War. We talked about Europe. We talked about the Marshall Plan. We talked about the Truman Doctrine, the Berlin Airlift, all that sort of stuff. And so, in this next class, we are going to be talking about the Vietnam War. So, to fill in the gaps to help you catch up, we're going to be going over the Korean War. So let's get started. So, agenda, what's going to be happening today? First, we're going to start with Korea today. It's kind of like modern parts of Korea, the Japanese occupation of Korea, the post-World War II era, and then the war itself, its legacy, and then finally, everyone's favorite part, we're going to go into some of the memes. So let's get started. So when you think about Korea today, there are a few things I think that might come to your mind. Just take a second, think. Well, at least for me, first thing that probably popped into my mind is a lot of pop culture. K-pop is very popular with a lot of people. Maybe a lot of K-dramas, Korean barbecue, a lot of different things, a lot of different cultural aspects that are very popular in America today, and that are becoming increasingly popular in America. So just you might wonder, how these things got popular, and we're not going to go quite into that today. But perhaps one of the reasons why this stuff is so popular and so relatable in American culture is because Korea actually has a lot of Western influence, and this is in many ways, because of the Korean War. Here we have a map of North and South Korea, of course. When I talk about Korea today, we're usually talking about South Korea culturally. North Korea is, of course, communist. We're going to get into the background behind that. So, next slide. So, some of the background. So, just prior to, we talked about World War II. So, Korea was occupied by Korea. Sorry, Korea was occupied by Japan. My bad. For quite some time, since 1910, actually. So, quite a bit before the Second World War, even before the First World War. So, very long time was occupied. Military reoccupation, however, came back into place around the Second World War era. And of course, the Korean people resisted this. They did not like being under the influence of the Japanese. And in many cases, the influence that the Japanese had was not necessarily a good thing. As you can see, there's some pictures. Japanese were not, as with most of their places that they occupy, they were not particularly kind to the citizens of that country. And so when the war ends, Korea becomes to be divided between the Soviet sections, Russia, and the U.S. sections in America. Much like Europe, we talked about how Europe was divided. We talk about Winston Churchill's phrase that an iron curtain has descended over Europe. So a similar thing over here in Asia. Korea is also partitioned. We'll get into that in a bit. So in the war, we have, much like in the different Soviet Eastern Bloc versus Western countries, we have different leaders. So in the South, we have Ri Sung-mun. He was the leader of South Korea. He was U.S. trained, U.S. Western educated. So obviously someone that would have sided much more with the U.S. We have Kim Il-sung, and yes, he is the grandfather of the current dictator of North Korea, Kim Il-jung. And then we have President of the United States, Harry Truman, and the infamous dictator of Russia, Joseph Stalin, of course. So a little bit of what happened. So basically, much like in Europe and Germany, where Germany split. So as I said, it's partitioned. We have the leader of the South, they have the leader of the North, and things are kind of at a status quo for a bit. Neither side moves to the other. They're kind of at not necessarily in a sense of peace, but nothing, they're not openly at war. Eventually, there's some skirmishes and stuff, but it's not until Stalin trains and equips the North Korean army that North Korea invades and attacks South Korea. Now, at this time, much like in Western Europe, where there was a lot of American military presence. There was some U.S. military presence, but it was mostly concentrated in Japan. And so U.S. forces and the South Korean military forces were ill-equipped to deal with this. And so when the North Korean forces came in that were more well-trained and more well-equipped, they swept over them very, very quickly, and they drove them back pretty much to the very edge of the Korean peninsula. So things were not looking good for the Koreans, so to say. And so then America decided to get more involved. Harry Truman decided to go to the UN, and he asked for a UN policing action. Usually, the other permanent members of the UN, as we've talked about the UN in the past, the Soviet Union and China would have vetoed this, but at this point, or sorry, not China, just the Soviet Union would have vetoed this, but they were boycotting the Soviet or the United Nations at the moment because of diplomatic issues. So he was able to turn into a policing action rather than a full-out war. Now, just let's think about this for a moment. Why wouldn't he have wanted to just declare war? Why would he have done that? Let's ask ourselves that. Maybe you've thought about it, might have some answers. So the reason for this is, of course, because a war is a very scary, very big thing, very complicated. But a policing action, that's a lot less threatening. It sounds a lot better. We're just policing them. It sounds a lot better. Kind of similar to nowadays. We might send people. Might send people to the Middle East. We don't necessarily call it a war. In some cases we do, but in other, we might call it a policing action. Sounds a lot better. So moving on. We have the war itself. So as I said earlier, South Korea is not prepared. The communist North Koreans sweep down to the end of the peninsula. And then from there, U.S. forces under General MacArthur, who we'll talk about some more, they come in from the south from Japan, along with UN coalition forces. MacArthur does a very daring landing at Incheon, which is it's a very tidal, very unpredictable port over here. So with that, they're able to do a pincer movement and push the North Koreans all the way to the border, which ends up being a bad idea. So any ideas why that might be a bad idea? You look at the map. Who is right next to North Korea? And the answer, of course, would be China. So China, think about this, at this point is a communist country, and they do not like that the U.S. forces are getting really close to them. Now, imagine if you were China, if you saw a foreign capitalistic power that, might take over your country. We might think of that as weird today, but, they never knew. They might attack us. So they found that very threatening. And so they decided to counterattack. And Mao Zedong, the leader of China, sends, hundreds of thousands of troops down in, and they overwhelm the American forces. They go down as far as to take Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea. And then the U.S. is able to very barely push the North Koreans and Chinese forces up to the previous line. At this point, the armistice line. Also, they have a demilitarized zone around there. And this is the current border. Even to this day, there's still this stretch of demilitarized area. There's forces on either side. It's like a strip of where the military isn't allowed. And so, yeah, that's what happens in the war itself. Like I said, just recap, North Koreans come down, MacArthur comes up, goes into China, almost gets into China. In fact, he actually requested that Truman give him nukes to stop the Chinese from coming in if that was a possibility. Of course, that gets denied because, giving, MacArthur 30 nukes would have been a very bad idea. And then, North Korea comes back down when the Chinese feel threatened, and then it evens out over there, the armistice line. So legacy, you may have heard of the famous dictator Kim Jong-un. You hear about him in the news all the time. He tries to launch missiles at us. Again, we're one of the few remaining dictatorships of a communist country that remain. We're definitely not on good terms. In South Korea, an interesting social thing is that all men have to be conscripted into the military. So there's a few exceptions to this, but of course, all men have to serve a certain amount of time. So that's another interesting thing. So some of the legacies of today that have happened. Now we have the memes, of course, everybody's favorite part of this section. I like memes. They will help you guys kind of remember some of this. So going back to that map, if you remember, we have this meme. It's like, the Americans, they're getting pushed back. Then they start pushing in, they're doing good. And then the Chinese attack and they're not doing so good. We have Truman. So I was talking about MacArthur wants 50 atomic bombs so he can completely destroy the border. And then Truman's like, bro, you're crazy. Another MacArthur meme. He orders troops to cross the 38th parallel. They get close to China. China gets involved, and MacArthur's like, what? Why would you do that? So here you go, some memes. Hopefully you enjoy those. Hopefully they'll help you to remember some of this stuff. So remember, if you have any questions, you can bring them up next time in class when we go over the Vietnam War at the beginning of class. Other than that, I hope you enjoy this presentation, and I will see you guys in class.